Good afternoon, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of ISAS, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, or ISAS, I warmly welcome you to this afternoon's book launch for India Today, Economy, Politics and Society, come panel discussion. To start off, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Tan Tayong, Director of ISAS, to deliver the opening remarks. Professor Tan, please.
Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, distinguished panelists, colleagues, and friends. First of all, let me extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this afternoon's book launch and panel discussion. I am especially delighted to welcome Professor Niraja Gopal-Jayal, Professor and Chairperson, Center for the Study of Law and Governance at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'm very glad that she's able to travel to Singapore to join us for this afternoon's launch. Now, those of you who have been following ISAS activities for the past few years will realize that we have been launching a number of books recently, most of them written, in fact all of them written by ISAS faculty. These books have contributed to enriching the wider literature, academic literature and policy literature on South Asia, and today's book launch is another notable addition to these efforts by ISAS. Now, the book being launched today, India Today, Economy, Politics and Society, is co-authored by Professor John Harris, visiting research professor at ISAS. Now, for those of us who work on South Asia, I think we will all know of the reputation of Professor John Harris. He has done outstanding work on politics and the political economy of South Asia and India for several years, and his expertise range over agriculture, rural development, poverty, labor markets, civil society, and politics and governance in general. He has been doing extensive field work in India for decades, and I take my hat off to him because he continuously goes to do this very difficult field work in India, and he has not eased off after all these years. So I'm really inspired by his personal example. He has taught and worked at the London School of Economics and the University of East Anglia for several years, and is now a distinguished senior faculty at Simon Fraser University in Canada. He has been a visiting faculty at ISAS for more than 2 years now, and he has recently started a major research project within the Institute on young people in India, social change, development and politics, and this, as you can imagine, will entail a lot of field work in India, and he has already had one meeting with researchers in India, and there will be a series more leading to the conclusion of this very important project. Now, the book that we're going to launch today. Now, this book contextualizes India's high growth and rapid economic transformation over the last couple of decades with the social and political implications of such growth and transformation. Now, India has indeed come a long way from being identified as a large and typical developing economy to one that is poised to become a global economic powerhouse. But this fascinating transformation has been accompanied by disturbing socio-political features, such as widening income gap and regional disparities, poor governance, manifesting in deficient supply of public goods and basic services, insurgent outbreaks, and a fractured polity. So academics and policymakers are now debating on modern India, and what that debate centers on is whether India will be able to maintain economic progress notwithstanding many of these socio-political vulnerabilities. In their book, Professor Harris and his co-authors, Professor Stuart Cobridge and Professor Craig Jeffrey. Professor Stuart Cobridge is from the London School of Economics and Professor Jeffrey from Oxford University, study the nuances of India's modern political economy in the context of this core question by reviewing various strands of scholarship that has flourished on India's economic and social transformation over the last couple of decades. In this respect, the book is a valuable addition to the existing scholarship and research on India and South Asia. As an institute focusing on contemporary aspects of South Asia, particularly the region's economy, politics, and strategic affairs, ISAS is keen on tracking the enormous churnings that are now taking place in different countries of the region, particularly India, as they adjust to a globalized world with their own frailties. in this regard, this book by Professor Harris and other scholars, and also those from other faculty members from ISAS and contemporary South Asia, will continue to add to the variety of alternative perspectives on these particular developments. So we hope to maintain this tradition, and we look forward to inviting you to more book launches of other works that are done by our colleagues, and also to generate more discussion on developments in South Asia. So I take this opportunity once again to welcome all of you to this afternoon's event, and I hope that we'll have a fruitful discussion and follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tan. May I now invite Professor John Harris, co-writer of India Today, Economy, Politics and Society, to give us an introduction of the book. Professor Harris, please.
Well, first, thank you, Professor Tantayong, for those very kind remarks. And I mean, this is an occasion when I can actually say thank you to you and to ISAS for the hospitality that you have given me, the space that you have given me over the last 2 and more years. You know, most of the work that I did for this book was actually done at ISAS, so it really is an ISAS book. I don't usually speak from a text, but I'm a little bit worried about the time. So even though this is a fairly intimate occasion, I feel I'm really sort of speaking rather amongst friends. You'll forgive me if I do use my text. The book is actually a sequel to an earlier book that I wrote with my friend Stuart Corbridge at the London School of Economics. And that book was called Reinventing India. It was published in 2000. And Reinventing presents an analytical history of what might be thought of as the invention of modern India, and then of its gradual reinvention towards the end of the 20th century. What we call the invention of modern independent India came about through the struggles of Indian nationalists against colonial rule and their debates amongst themselves, especially in those more formal debates that took place in the Constituent Assembly that drew up the Constitution of India promulgated in 1950. The outcome was that India was defined in terms of what we consider 4 founding myths. The newly independent country was to be a parliamentary democracy, it was to be broadly socialist, secular in the particular sense of giving equal respect to all religions, and it was to be a federal state. Our book sought to show how and why these founding principles came to be undone, how and why India's democracy, though vibrant in some respects, was undermined by the practices of politicians and by limitations in the realization of the constitutional promise of universal citizenship. How and why the particular project of building a modern nation through what Nehru referred to as a third way of democratic socialism came to be replaced by the pursuit of neoliberal principles in economic policy. How the secular character of the Indian state was challenged by the rise of Hindu nationalism and the electoral success of the Bharatiya Janata Party, and how Indian federalism that had initially been of a distinctly centralized kind was being changed through the operations of a federal market economy. As Stuart Corbridge and I saw it, both the shifts in economic policy that took place in the 1990s and the rise of Hindu nationalism could be seen as elite revolts in the context of the increasing plebeian assertiveness most clearly reflected in the emergence of a new generation of political leaders from amongst the OBCs and the Dalits, the likes especially of Mulayam Singh Yadav in UP, Lalu Prasad Yadav in Bihar, and the Dalit leader Mayawati. By about 2000, when Reinventing was published, India was still, of course, formally a democracy, but there was little indication that there was much of what we might call substantial democracy. the broad, substantive, perhaps would be a better word, substantive democracy. The very broad developmental objectives of the Nehruvian state had been replaced by a single-minded commitment to economic growth to be achieved by the dedicated pursuit of economic liberalism. Secularism and inclusive citizenship stood, it seemed, to be overwhelmed by the construction of a Hindu Rashtra that seemed a distinct possibility given the political ascendancy of the BJP, and Indian federalism was under strain from the increasing inequality between states. I just thought it was worthwhile recapping a little what we had said, sorts of things that we had argued in the earlier book, because I want really, in a way, to look back to around 2000, because what India Today, this book, is rather about what has happened over the last decade or so. It is, I should say, I think that I should full tribute to my co-authors, Stuart Corbridge, who's now Deputy Director, actually, of the LSE, and Craig Jeffrey, and I'm very proud of the fact that Craig Jeffrey, now a full professor at Oxford, is actually our former student. It's an attempt on our part to write contemporary history, but the book is organised thematically around a series of questions. When and why did India take off? How have the poor fared? Why hasn't economic growth delivered more for Indian workers? Is the Indian state delivering on promises of inclusive growth and social justice? Has India's democracy been a success? Is the government of India becoming more responsive? Has the rise of Hindu nationalism halted? Why has Maoism become such a force in rural India? Does India have a civil society? Does caste still matter? How much have things changed for Indian women? Can India benefit from its demographic dividend? It's a pretty comprehensive treatment, I think, though there are some obvious gaps, notably in regard to the environment. I think we also wish that we'd been able to dedicate a chapter as well to what is going on in India's big cities. What I thought I'd do now, rather than trying to summarize our answers to that long list of questions that we've raised, I thought I'd rather like to point to what I consider to be fundamental factors that influence the ways in which India is changing economically, socially, and politically. There are three key factors as I see it. Firstly, the class character of the Indian state. Secondly, the failure of the structural transformation of the economy. And thirdly, the persistence and the deepening of inequality, which is still substantially legitimated by hierarchical social values. I can perhaps best explain how I understand the class character of the Indian state by reference to what it is not. It is not a developmental state in which a strong executive is able to provide incentives to private capital, including, if necessary, by getting the prices wrong or governing the market, to use the key phrases of the best studies of East Asian developmental states, that by Alice Amsden of South Korea and of Robert Wade on Taiwan. But the executive of the developmental state doesn't only set up incentives for business. It combines this with a capacity for disciplining private capitals. For example, by the switching off of support for companies that aren't successful in export markets. The Indian state, it seems to me, has never had this capacity, in spite of the rhetoric of some politicians, including Nehru at times, and in spite of legislation such as that directed against monopolies. I mean, just to pause for a moment. You know, Jawaharlal Nehru sometimes participated in debates in the Lok Sabha in which there was a lot of, fiery talk about nationalization and so on. But very often he was just a couple of days later talking to Fiki in Calcutta or something and saying something rather different to big business people. The most persuasive model of the class character of the Indian state through to the early 1980s is that of Pranab Bardhan, who argued that the capacities of the state were constrained by the contestations for power between three propertied classes: big business, the dominant landholders, and the professional bureaucratic elite. Development resources, Bardhan argues, were frittered away in subsidy payments and unproductive rents made to these three classes. Now, as Bardhan himself suggests, the state is effectively dominated by corporate capital. Pranab speaks of the corrupt grip of the corporate oligarchy in Indian political life. Our own, speaking of here, of ISAS, Dr. Narayan of ISAS spoke to me only a few days ago of what he described as the stranglehold of a small number of powerful corporations that actually prevent the liberalization of the economy when it suits them. When, for example, they're able to benefit from the selective allocation by governments of 2G spectrum or of mining concessions. And it's striking that a recent analysis of the basis of the wealth of India's $46 billionaires shows that income from rents exceeds that from profits in technology-intensive productive industry and services. The powerful corporations benefit, too, from some of the lowest rates of corporate taxation amongst major economies, which sit, of course, alongside their demands for control of the fiscal deficit by the cutting back of programs that might deliver on the promise of economic and social rights, and especially the delivery by the state of decent health and educational facilities, in regard to which state expenditure in India is notably low in relation to comparator economies. The poor public provisioning of education and healthcare in India is one of the reasons for doubting how effectively India will be able to capitalize on its demographic dividend. That is, the advantage of having a period in which the numbers of the labour force will be relatively high in relation to the numbers of those dependent upon them. The second factor that I think is quite fundamentally important is what I call the failure of the structural transformation of the economy, which to a great extent follows from the class character of the state. By structural transformation, I mean simply the great transformation of the structure of economy and society that's expected to take place through the process of economic development, which sees agriculture and primary production overtaken by industry and services in contributions to GDP, and the shift of labour out of agriculture into manufacturing and services. This, of course, hasn't taken place in India. In 1950 to 51, agriculture accounted for 61% of GDP and for 76% of employment. Now it accounts for only 16% of GDP or thereabouts, but still for more than 50% of employment. Some recent data suggest that the share of employment in agriculture has actually increased slightly in the course of the last decade. Structural transformation has effectively failed. It isn't happening. A large share of the Indian labour force is effectively excluded, I believe, from productive employment. It is a population that is in some sense surplus to the needs of capital accumulation. And the pattern of India's recent tremendous surge of economic growth, far from delivering on the promise of inclusive growth, is rather described as jobless. National Sample Survey data for the period 2005 to 2010 show that usual status employment has increased by just 0.1% per annum. Jobs are just not being created. Without the creation of decent jobs that provide for a degree of security for people, there's little prospect of inclusive growth. Even the absolute numbers of those in good jobs in the formal sector declined for a time early in this millennium, and there's been a steady trend of informalization even of jobs in big formal sector companies, with the expansion of contract labour, which cuts costs and enhances profits, but at the expense of secure livelihoods. Meanwhile, the agricultural economy, though it's now growing again after a decade of stagnation, is still characterized by low levels of productivity. Average yields of rice, for instance, are only about half those of China, and farms of less than 2 hectares in extent, which means at least 3/4 of them, do not adequately provide for the livelihood requirements of their households. My third factor is the persistence and deepening of material inequality, which is still substantially legitimated by hierarchical social values. One way of pointing out the deep inequality in Indian society is in the observation that there is a missing middle in India today, in spite of all the hype about India's burgeoning middle class. As none other than Professor T.N. Srinivasan has pointed out, if the middle class is defined as people with an income above $10 a day, but excluding the top 5% of the population, then even urban India has no middle class, because everyone at over $10 per day is in the top 5%. There is in India now a very marked dualism with a dollar economy, in which prices, as for that vitally important commodity beer, in what are called London pubs, in Delhi shopping malls, prices there for those pints of beer are often higher than in the UK or Canada. Meanwhile, there's a rupee economy in which the finest meal you can buy in a Mofussil town, for example, in Tamil Nadu, and it would be a fine meal, can cost no more than $2 or $3. We know that increasing inequality restricts the poverty-reducing effects of economic growth. Beyond this, the inequalities of Indian society undermine citizenship by making most poor working people dependent upon the mediations of local bosses and politicians in their relations with the state, and substantially account for the persistence of what has been described as patronage democracy. Yet inequality, for all that caste, as we explain in the book, is less significant than it was, is still legitimated. Inequality is still legitimated by those hierarchical values, which still force, for instance, many Dalits into the worst possible jobs and positions in society. And competition for privileges and benefits from the state between people from different social groups, most of them defined on the basis of caste, takes precedence over struggles for greater social justice. No wonder there is so little evidence of political mobilization against the yawning inequalities of Indian society. I'm very well aware that I've presented a bleak view of Indian society today, and some of you here may indeed think that it is a very one-sided view of Indian society today. What can be placed on the other side of the scales? As we argue in our chapter on civil society, there's a great deal of optimism these days about the potentials of Indian civil society for bringing about change through movements such as that directed against corruption led by Anna Hazare, or more recently through the mobilizations around the rights of women in the wake of the appalling rape incident in Delhi in December. We think that there's actually a lot of does one say hubris or hubris? I'm never quite sure. We think that there is hubris in much that is written and said about the potentials of civil society, and that middle-class civil society, and we think of as civil society in India, is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily a sphere of middle-class activism. Middle-class civil society is often neither very civil nor very social. But there are also widespread struggles amongst poor working people over their rights as citizens. Struggles, in a sense, for the establishment of a civil society in bastis, joggi-jopris, squatter settlements. I know I'm a little bit of a romantic about it, but I think of something called the Pen Urme Ekam, Women's Rights Association in Madras, in Chennai, which is a movement of poor women from slums, many of them who've been subjected to domestic violence, working in construction sites as domestic labour. They're struggling for women's rights, which they tie together quite rightly with the struggle for the right to somewhere to live and the right to a livelihood. And of course, those three sets of rights do go together. These are people who are struggling actually to establish something like civil society in the context of the slum. It's a very long shot, talking about the long term, but I believe that there is reason for hope over the long term through the diffusion of these values of democratic citizenship through Indian society. Thank you very much. What's the next bit, Gov?
Thank you, Professor Harris. May I now invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of ISAS, to join Professor Harris on stage.
Move center stage.
No, you move center stage.
We shall now call upon Ambassador Pillai to launch the book India Today, Economy, Politics and Society.
That's it.
That's a nice picture of him.
Wow, who is this guy?
Recognize him, right?
May I now invite Professor Tan Tayong for a group photo, please?
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Sure.
And co-author of India since 1980. He was teaching at JNE before he joined ISAS. So can I ask Professor Jai, you can proceed? Sure.
Please take a little longer than longer. Your reputation doesn't go out of the scenes in this matter. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today to speak on this wonderful book, which I have to say, there's a pattern here. I also spoke in a panel discussion on the prequel, as we call them in India, to this book. That's an Indianism. The opposite of sequel is prequel. So I spoke at the panel discussion of the Political Studies Association of the UK several years ago when Reinventing India was just published. So it's especially pleasant to be here and to do this today. And in fact, I began reading this as a successor to Reinventing India. I wasn't sure that John would see it as a sequel, but it clearly is one. I think, of course, this book has one additional author. That one was written by John Harris and Stuart Corbridge. And this book also has a rather innovative structure, which I like very much. Reinventing India had a central thesis about the founding myths. This one is structured around questions. So it's a bit like everything you always wanted to know about India but were afraid to ask. You have all the answers here. Almost all the important questions one might ask to do with the Indian economy, Indian society, Indian politics, which goes all the way from growth and poverty to civil society, caste, gender, and of course democracy, governance, and conflict. Like Reinventing India, this book is also bound to have a very wide public appeal. Perhaps to an even greater extent than that book, it gives us an enormous range of scholarship on a particular subject. Every chapter has a particular theme, situated in the context of a vast comparative as well as considerable theoretical literature on the subject. The scholarship is, I'm happy to say, worn rather lightly, so there's no ponderous academic debate. We have a solid treatment that is informed by expertise, by the best expertise on the subject, but that the intelligent layperson can comprehend and profit from. The best thing for me was the fact that it has this most amazing bibliography of over 50 pages, which is a huge treasure. And I hate to say this, lest it damage my academic reputation forever, but it has no footnotes. So everything is in the text itself, so it's wonderful. Anyway, I'll make a few comments focusing on particular areas, politics, governance, and society. And I start with the chapter titled, Is the Indian State Delivering on Promises of Inclusive Growth and Social Justice? And I agree with John and his co-authors that, as they say, and I quote here, social justice remains a field of contestation that shows up fault lines in contemporary Indian society, unquote. But the really important question, of course, is which fault lines? The authors identify a contention between, or rather within, the elites, within the middle class, between a distinctly liberal and what they call a broadly social democratic project. The problem is that these classes are participants, definitely energetic participants in the inclusive growth debate. And these positions that they have taken, liberal or broadly social democratic, are positions in and within the inclusive growth debate. They are, however, external to the debate on social justice. The phrase social justice is, in the Indian popular political imagination, not about rights at all. It is about identities, it is about caste politics, it is about the politics of backwardness. On the whole, in popular mobilizations, as well as in the discourse of political parties, this is the meaning of social justice that tends to trump other meanings of justice as distributive, justice in the sense of social and economic rights, the way in which academics tend to think about social justice. But in the Indian political discourse, that is not the way in which social justice is thought about. So the question of which fault lines, I think, is a very important question, and I fully agree with the authors that this remains a field of contestation, but it's a field of multiple contestations, or at least dual contestations, rather than one type of contestation. On to the chapter on how a weak state promoted audacious reform. And weak within single inverted commas, I don't quite know why. Professor Harris just presented a few minutes ago a most persuasive argument about the Indian state. But one wonders if the Indian state should really be described as weak. If it were purely held to ransom by corporate interests, which it is partially, only held by corporate interest to ransom, it would be one thing. But one wonders if, given the nexus between, the mutually enriching nexus between capital, the political class, and the bureaucracy, this is an adequate description. And this is the nexus, after all, with all its faults, the anti-corruption movement has targeted. So the Indian state is certainly weak in capacity to deliver development, or responsive governance, or even public service delivery. But it is strong enough somewhere. It has a structural strength, a reserve power, which enables it to effect reforms that are unpopular, to enact laws like the SEZ Act 2005 in a matter of minutes without almost any debate. So it has a certain reserve power and a certain structural strength, and I'm wondering whether we need to revisit the characterization used by Suzanne and Lloyd Rudolph many, many years ago, when they called it a weak-strong state, and maybe need to rethink, weak in relation to which classes, strong in relation to which other classes, and so on. Maybe that category still has some purchase. But I think that this chapter opens up a really interesting research agenda, and I hope that in future, in the sequel to this one, there will be some further reflections on this. On India's democracy and whether it's been a success or not, the authors make the distinction, which has been, which is standard in our literature, formal versus substantive democracy. I was intrigued by the fact, and I'd like Professor Harris to respond if he can to this, by the fact that the institutions of formal democracy are assessed, and quite favorably, at the national level, while the indicators of substantive democracy are addressed at the state level. Now, it could be the case, arguably, that the institutions of formal democracy may also reflect significant variations and differences across the states, particularly if you think about states that have experienced conflict. If you think about Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, if you think about the Northeast, if you think about Assam, think about Kashmir, then maybe even the institutions of formal democracy will not seem so invariably successful. So in terms of institutionalization, deinstitutionalization, the performance of state legislatures and so on, there could be significant variations across the states as well in terms of formal democracy. Why then should we employ two different levels of analysis when we talk about formal and substantive democracy? I'm sure you have a very good answer to this, but I just thought I'd put the question out there. I have a little bit of a disagreement with the authors who have made sort of a few comments in passing about the Indian Administrative Service, and this is central to India's governance as we know. There is an assumption that the IAS is a strong institution and, to use their own words, contributing to effective government and political stability. I think this is contestable. Even the government's own successive administrative reforms commissions have reflected on this and have recognized this as a problem. The problems with providing responsive governance in India are not only to do with the bureaucracy that Joel Migdal memorably called the bureaucracy in the trenches, or street-level bureaucrats as Harris and Co. have called them, but all the way from the top to the bottom, just in different ways. And one of the most illuminating recent books on this subject is the eponymous An Insider's View by a recently retired IAS officer called Javed Chowdhury, who tells us that if you look at the first 15 years after independence, the IAS, there was a paternalist model of governance. Then the 1960s to the 1980s is a developmental phase when civil servants had a say in public policy, framing public programs, originating development schemes. But since the advent of liberalization and globalization, economics, business, international trade, banking, the kinds of expertise that civil servants need, the generalist civil servant no longer has. So the decline of the generalist civil servant in an age of expertise, particularly certain sorts of expertise, he claims has given rise to a new caste system within the bureaucracy. The new Brahmins, so to speak, are the liberalizers whose power derives from their predominance, from their expertise over the economic issues, and from the predominance of the people he calls the economic czars, the top bosses of economic policy making. But more significantly, I think, and this is a concern that speaks to subsequent chapters as well, this book by Javed Chowdhury implicitly expresses a profound tension in the way in which the definition of the public interest has changed. Above all, in the mindsets of those who have been the custodians of it since independence, that is the civil service. He says 50 years ago, the civil service was a major force for the good in defining the public interest. Now, however, and I quote him, the coin of public interest is an extinct currency. 50%, he says, are venal as an insider. But how much of this is because of the venality of that 50%, or simply because the landscape of governance has changed, making it impossible for that particular clock to be turned back? In a sense, the contestation over how the public interest is defined lies at the very core of Indian debates today. Even the anti-corruption mobilization, the Anna Hazare movement, expresses a particular conception of the public interest, which in some instances, and I refer here to Arvind Kejriwal's new book Swaraj, rejects the institutions of parliamentary democracy in favor of more direct or decentralized forms of democratic decision making. This is something that Indian society has to negotiate. Finally, do I have a couple of more points? One on, does India have a civil society? I am in complete agreement with the authors and their dominant thesis about middle-class activism. I am in general in agreement with their repudiation of what might be called a conceptual purism about the use of these terms, such as civil society, that marks, for instance, very sharply Professor Andre Bethé's new book, Democracy and Its Institutions. I was happy also to see Partha Chatterjee's binary of civil and political society being interrogated, not from the perspective of conceptual purism, because I don't think that's a very sensible way to interrogate it, but in more substantive terms. However, I would like to elaborate a little more on the argument here about civil society. I think there were more problems with the Anna Hazare movement than the one that this book identifies, which is the disparagement of parliamentary institutions. The movement leaders have been happy to consort with all manner of religious leaders, even with some members of the political class, including senior ministers, whose venality was in fact the object of their attack. It did not have any kind of a progressive agenda beyond anti-corruption, no progressive governance agenda, not even, I mean, let alone the kind of thing that you saw in, I won't compare it with the Arab Spring, but certainly the Occupy movements. There is little evidence that the people who supported this movement in large numbers are also sensitive to problems of poverty and inequality in India, are sensitive to the inequalities of caste and minority status. There's very little evidence to tell us that. Similarly, the more recent mobilization against the gang rapes in Delhi in December 2012, we find similar, equally grotesque forms of sexual violence being perpetrated against women in rural India on a daily basis, but we don't necessarily see the same kind of outpouring on the streets, which is not to undermine the importance of that, of those protests. They were extremely important. I participated in them myself, so I obviously recognize their importance. However, having said that, I think we need to recognize that our attention and our anger is provoked only at particular moments when middle-class activists rise for middle class, in support of middle-class constituencies. More than that, what has worried me, and John, I'd like your response to this, because you mentioned cities at the end as a gap. These protests of thousands of young men and women in December and January was appropriated in what I consider unfortunate ways to construct a new social divide between the urban and the rural. Many very influential media people made the argument that the government needs to wake up and give urban India its due. The argument is deeply flawed, of course, but it goes something like this. The government listens only to rural India because rural India has more votes. It is high time now that the urban middle classes who have gathered at India Gate and Jantar Mantar and in many other cities across India also be heard. Now this is disturbing because leave aside the question of when this urban India last bothered to exercise its franchise. What is urban India anyway? Does it encompass the urban poor or does it not? And a lot of the time it does not. Is urban just a metaphor for the urban middle class and upper class? Which I suspect it is. The unfortunate girl who was raped and killed in that terrible incident was aspirationally middle class. Hers was exactly the kind of class mobility story that elites love, because it preserves their faith in the inherent fairness and the opportunities of the post-liberalization model of urban development and prosperity. If she'd been a poor girl from a slum who dropped out in 5th grade, worked as a part-time domestic, one wonders if she would have been quite as wholeheartedly embraced by these groups. But in general, the tendency to create and to construct these sorts of new social divides between urban and rural is not, I believe, conducive to building a more generalized sense of social solidarity. Does caste still matter in India? It does, and the authors have also suggested that it does, even though to a lesser extent they say that before. I would add to this a couple of small points, which is the debate on Muslim quotas, whether they should be restricted to the lower castes, the backward castes, among the Muslims, the Pasmanda groups or not. Again, the debate on the women's reservation bill, the fact that this bill has not been enacted, though it has been under consideration for 16 or now 17 years perhaps, which is stuck only on the issue of sub-quotas. Other sub-quota debates, all the way from Nagaland to Rajasthan, and Andhra Pradesh to Uttar Pradesh. All of this suggests that the political and administrative salience of caste is greater than ever before. Its social salience, as expressed in overt discrimination, may have declined even if marginally, and at least partially as a result of urbanization. And finally, how much have things changed for Indian women? This is a really important chapter because it links women's control over land and assets to issues of access and power, and both of these to empowerment in general. I would go even further to look at not only what women have not achieved in comparison to men, but also the forms of sexual violence that are part of the structural condition of women from the prenatal stage to the end of their lives. Access to power can certainly have a literally empowering effect, but one of the surveys that, John, you've not mentioned in this book is one that, in fact, I was associated with. It's a study of, it was a sample size of 20,000 households in 27 states, a study of elected women representatives in panchayats. And the interesting thing about this survey, at least two interesting findings that I quickly share here are these, that the gender gap on this issue of community satisfaction with male representatives versus female sarpanches, actually, heads of panchayat, the level of community satisfaction with male sarpanches and female sarpanches, the difference was merely 2 percentage points. That's all. The difference on many other counts
In
was
favor of
equally,
women?
No, not in favor of 2 percentage points. The very parties that define their politics in terms of social justice, in fact, to return to the social justice point, the very parties that define their politics in terms of social justice are the most relentless in controlling women in these ways. And, so those who speak about social justice the loudest are actually also the quickest to want to entrench gender inequalities or not to allow them to be transcended. Above all, sexual violence from female feticide reflected in sex ratios which have been skewed, which are improving marginally, slightly better than before, to migration as a result of the declining sex ratio migration, bringing in brides who are basically slaves from other states and so on, to the kinds of things we were talking about a while ago, which is explicit violence. But I have greatly enjoyed reading this book, and I hope that the next book will also add Indian culture, culture and society to this. No, I mean, because the long-term impact of the kind of migration and urbanization that we are seeing is an impact not only on politics and society, but it's also an impact on mass culture. There will be portable identity proofs. We spoke about that this morning. There are intermarriages. There is possibly likely to be a greater fungibility of caste identities and so on. So I hope that the next edition, the sequel, will talk about these long-term impacts of migration and urbanization. And I also hope that it will return to a topic that has not been studied for some time now, which is how robust are India's institutions. I think it's time to reevaluate those as well. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
What you hear from me, I am, as most of you know, not a specialist on Indian affairs, although I do keep some contact with it. And certainly I found this book to be a wonderful education. I must say I agree with everything that Professor Jayal brought up. In fact, I was wondering first, what kind of book is this going to be? And I mean, is it going to be, as you say, a thematically developed thing? Is it going to be a particular, a specialized study? And so I was actually quite delighted that this would work very well as, let me qualify, work very well as a very advanced graduate text. For instance, it covers all these topics, as you heard, and it covers all the up-to-date arguments and debates about these topics. And so you get a very comprehensive sort of statement of what the issues are here. And in fact, it goes into considerable detail about particularly the economic chapters in the beginning, about the debates in the realm of growth and distribution and those issues. And some of it gets a little technical if you're not an economist, but it is very useful to have. And I would say that it's like going through a Mahabharata through the hand-to-hand combat. You know? That's what they do. They sort of cover it at that level of detail, and so it can be. You know, if it's something you have to digest, you better be a big python, because you know it's a large meal, and for that it's very rewarding. You learn a lot, and very nicely what they do at the end of this is not in all the chapters. I suspect each author has his own version style. But at the end of a particularly complex set of debates, they provide their own take on it, which is usually a very balanced take, right? I mean, there is, you know, this is good for this, but this is a little, you know, bit much not acceptable, and this is what we have our own view on it. And so, from that perspective, you can come out feeling quite educated and enlightened. So that's it's a remarkably useful work, especially if you're a teacher of Indian studies, Indian political economy. Now, a little bit about their attitude and approach. I was a little bit surprised to hear Professor Harris present his rather dismal view of the Indian situation, because I don't think that you get, or not of the Indian situation, let me say in particular of the major political actors in India, of which the state, of course, is primary. And because I thought that the analysis itself, particularly through the modality through which I just described, it presents this kind of balance, and it sort of also talks considerably about, you know, the kinds of policies, state policies and so on, that have had some effect on the ground. I think it's a little too much to say success, but that have been able to deliver some things, and so on. So there is that in the book, I think, more than you might expect. But of course there is also, I mean, what he said is also reflects not just the book, but the reality on the ground about the weakness of many of the Indian, certainly, institutions of delivery. Now, I just wanted to isolate a few themes which they take up. There are many themes there, and we were in fact asked to sort of pick on certain areas of particular interest. And so I picked on three themes. The first is the issue of civil society, and here this is in several chapters, in several different chapters, but more particularly in one or two, which I have not worked very closely to mark out which chapters precisely. But fundamentally, it's around, I think, and I think very appropriately, around the issue brought up by Professor Partha Chatterjee on civil society and political society. And this is, for those of you, this has already been discussed. For those of you who are not familiar with this distinction, it is that civil society is something that comes out from the Western tradition, and Hegel's philosophy is invoked to understand it, and it generally refers to the sphere of middle class associational activity of a modern political system, which leaves out, of course, the bulk of the population, which is not middle class and associational in the same way. and does not and is not necessarily urban, and they use much more the existing political system, which with very high transaction costs and politicians and so on. And here they produce a lot of details about discussions of pradhans in slums and so on, which is very useful about how these are the agencies through which the poor manage to get some resources and some things to which they have been entitled in their societies, particularly for their social needs and so on. I think that this is one that is a very interesting issue, and I would say that the whole civil society, political society, incidentally, the main theme question that I have at the end of this, particularly not being an Indian specialist, an India specialist, is, I mean, how much does this book reflect and lead us to think about the position of India, the status of India in global scholarship of what's happening, or in global politics and global society and globalization. I mean, to what extent do these trends and institutional effects reveal larger global forces? And clearly, the three issues that I'm taking up, but perhaps all of these issues, are in fact particularized expressions of things that are happening over the last 20 years all over the world. In particular, of course, I see perhaps most contrasting, in some ways contrastingly, but also addressing very similar issues in China. The three issues that I talk about, the emergence of an urban middle-class associational sphere, which is called civil society in the Indian context, also emerges in China, and with also the kind of divisions. I mean, you have rural activists and migrant labor in China and so on, who do not have access to this kind of middle-class association. But even more, I think, in other parts of Asian societies, in Latin America and so on, and perhaps increasingly in Africa, you're beginning to see the same kind of tensions. So there's that issue of civil society and political society. The second issue that I think also has considerable resonances elsewhere is this whole question of governance. Governance, particularly in the moment of what we have called the post-neoliberal state, right? We don't really know how to think about it, but they're going beyond neoliberalism in many important, well, they're not necessarily going beyond, but they are, perhaps they even, you know, in the Latin American context, this is called, what is it called? Neo-structuralism, where they talk about it essentially as really reacting to the differentiations, to the stratifications, to the negative effects of neoliberal globalization. And so you had this whole, from the 2000s, you had, you know, all of these Latin American governments that were much more the kind of new socialist types of people like Chavez and so on. And to some extent, I think India and China are also reacting very much to this kinds of effects of neoliberalism. But to what extent does it change the technologies of redistribution? To what extent does it change the modalities of redistribution? To what extent does it deal with questions of governance in ways that we had understood it earlier, before the neoliberal moment, is of course something that is still questionable, and something that can come, I think, we can gain an understanding of it through this kind of comparative situation. So I think that's something that is very interesting. And here, both our speakers before me have talked to some extent about this new state sort of model. And I think this is something that the book hints at, but does not develop sufficiently. Professor Jayal brought up the idea of the new kind of technocratic administrator in the IS. I think this is a very important issue. The whole question of expertise now dominates government in a way that it never did before. And it's actually very interesting to try and think of whether this model of expertise, which also incidentally seeks to keep out lots of civil society, NGO organizations who, incidentally, I think do straddle much more the political society, civil society than we would believe. And this is something that the book also does speak to. I mean, the ways in which the differentiation, the strict differentiation of civil society and political society is actually in reality bridged in many different kinds of ways. Though, of course, you know, there are these divisions remain, and it's very interesting to see both whether we go more with Professor Jayal's idea that someone like Anna Hazare and so on, because he's not progressive in a leftist sense of the word, is in fact that's separated from rural aspirations, and whether in fact they don't present a certain type of conservative bridge, quite possibly, which is, you know, depends on your politics there, right? So, so there are different kinds of bridges that are sort of emerging, and I've lost my train of thought, but it's okay. I'll finish off soon. So first was political society, civil society, and governance. And no, the question I was thinking of is that with this new kind of technocratic expertise, and particularly the usage of technology and the usage of public-private partnerships, all of this new apparatus, while throwing money, you know, both in 2005, India started the Narega scheme, which I see very much as a post-neoliberal thing, and China just absolved all agricultural taxes and created all these new instruments for private-public partnership, in a sense, you know. So all these new technologies of intervention and so on, does political society then work in an interesting way with this technocratic government? You know, and how does it work? And how does it mediate that? It becomes a three-way relationship in some ways. Now, and the final thing that I think this book does very well is really point to the manner in which, though I think there's a contradictory dimension, especially as I was listening to Professor John Harris in this question, is the rural question, which is of great interest to me. The rural, am I going on too long?
I think you
2 minutes. 2 minutes. The rural question, it seems to me, is presented very lucidly by them at the first level, which is that they almost suggest that the rural problem is certainly not the type of problem that there was 30 years ago or 20 years ago. It has moved from being a purely agricultural problem to becoming a problem, which we know very well in neoliberal societies, of one of the new enclosure movements, right? Particularly in the forest realm, where in fact forest peoples, forest communities are losing their resources because of mineral, because of the new nature of capital and its movement into these types of earlier, less valuable resource bases and so on, that are now, or land grab for real estate developers and so on, with this growing urbanization and things like that. So you're getting a new type of contradiction. But today what I think I heard from John is much more how the rural situation it has not been touched and nothing is happening there. But I think there's a complexity here. I mean, on the one hand, we find that there is actually much less of, from some source here suggests that there's much less labor involved in agriculture per se. They may be in the rural sector, but it's much less. So in other words, it's in the informal economy. And of course, we don't have a proper understanding for obvious or self-evident reasons of how to understand the informal economy and informal society. I mean, where does it stand in relation to everything else? It seems to me is something that also has to be explored here. So anyway, I'm going to just close here without any ceremonial conclusion or trying to produce some kind of symmetry and order and move on because my time is over.
And well, 10 minutes is justified because, you know, the dons have spoken and there's very little to say on that. I think the point that I would want to make is that I take home, and I will not be very critical. I mean, I really admire this book. You You can take issue with many things and they can be. But I think it makes 5 distinct contributions. The first contribution is what the legendary Cambridge Dawn Joan Robinson used to say about India. She used to say that whatever you say about the Indian economy, the contrary is always true. and although John painted a somewhat dismal picture, this picture is actually very balanced. And for every negative that he talked about, there's a kind of a counter positive. And the book really allows you to see debate between the positive and the negative. And I'll belabor that point in a little bit. The second important point I want to make is that this is a very, very sober assessment. It is not driven by the idea that John likes class or he likes society. It is not driven by the idea that he wants to paint India poor or he wants to paint India rich. This is a very sober assessment. The third point I want to make is that they really believe that history matters. That nothing happens as a result of a meteor hitting you at the time of a critical juncture. That history matters. The fourth point I think that comes out of this book is that it doesn't address a lot of very important questions which unfortunately have not been addressed by scholars. And there's a lot of important questions on India that have not been addressed. And finally, this is a very Indo-centric account of India. This doesn't read like somebody from outside watching India. This is a very Indo-centric, and I'll talk a little bit about the political society debate that they bring in and why I think they're so sympathetic about how scholarship in India and how they think about what's happening in India. So to the first point, they clearly believe, the authors clearly believe that India is on a different kind of growth path. And they do it unhesitatingly. So while they do believe that it is on a growth path, and that growth path is very different, it is respectable, and you have to acknowledge it, they also believe that there is jobless growth, and jobless growth is not sustainable. They also believe that you can't reap the demographic dividend if you do not have health and education, and if women are not taken care of. They do believe that the nature of caste in relation to Indian society has changed. But they do add to say that while the nature of caste and its relationship with society and interpersonal relations has changed, there is a lot of negative that still persists, and that can be damning for social, political, and economic development in India. They do believe that, like in other countries, while you had neoliberal growth, there is what they believe a Karl Polanyi type of counter-movement. So neoliberal growth has also been accompanied by a movement which might be producing some kind of a welfare state. They do believe that India has a democracy, it has a vibrant participatory democracy, but they puzzle over the fact that while this democracy is vibrant and participatory, it is not producing good governance. And to address all of these issues, they actually bring in a lot of very important literature, almost all the important literature that I know. Second, this is a sober assessment. So if you're looking at the debate on the poverty line, the authors do not take the view that some authors do, that there are more poor people in India today than there was before independence. Neither do they take the view that there are hardly any poor people in India. They weigh these debates, and in weighing these debates, I think they take a sober assessment. They acknowledge the fact that the way in which the National Sample Survey was carried out in the 55th round was problematic. So if you want to take up an issue like democratic decentralization, they acknowledge the fact that democratic decentralization has produced positive benefits. But they also take into account the fact that there is caste, there is social structure, there is elite capture, and that in the rural areas, democratic decentralization has often not worked. And what has worked instead is a top-down effort from the higher levels of bureaucracy to actually see that things go down to the poor. There is a very serious attention to the fact that historical paths matter. So they will be the first person to acknowledge that you cannot understand the Indian economic transition just on the basis of a balance of payments crisis in 1991. In fact, they argue that you have to look at the accumulation of institutional, human, and physical capital development that has taken place over a long period of time that prepared India, and this entire issue of pro-business growth that took place in the 1980s to be able to understand why India was able to do what it did in 1991. Now, having said all this, there are silences in this book. And this is not just a silence in this book, but I think students of Indian politics and Indian political economy have really not addressed these issues in a straightforward manner. So when we are really talking about the growth transition, we are still not very clear whether it has happened because of class or because of ideas. What is the interaction between class and ideas? So when we are talking about this counter movement towards welfare, we do not know whether it has happened because of class or because of ideas. Of course, they bring in rich ethnography. They bring in almost everything that there is to it. But this is an area where I think this book kind of inspires you to think more deeply about social processes that are producing such large-scale change. And finally, the book takes, I think, a very Indocentric view, because there's been a discussion on social capital and the like. So they take Partha Chatterjee's civil society, political society head on by saying two things, essentially. One is that if you want to look at a society like India, you cannot just define civil society or political society as a bunch of impersonal relations, because that's not the character of Indian society. Then they acknowledge the fact, arising out of their own empirical work, that political society, which is considered not to be the realm of citizenship, but a bunch of people who make demands, and the state generally accedes to those demands as exceptions, is something which is not such a watertight compartment, because people are often in political society and in civil society, and you cannot make those distinctions so easily. So, for example, if you stretch that argument a little bit further, then, when MKSS and Aruna Roy were fighting for the right to information, at times they may have been in political society, because they were struggling to get things that were not constitutionally allowed at that point in time. But when they got those rights for themselves, for different states, as for the nation as a whole, that entire issue of official secrecy became redundant. The same can be said about NREGS and other issues there. So I think this is a very, very important issue that they have taken on, especially because, and I'm not suggesting that Partha Chatterjee's view of political society is wrong. I think it's an excellent idea that has provoked debate, and I think this book takes us a little bit further and makes us think about how to relate a somewhat purely Hegelian idea in terms of how it really works on the Indian ground. Thank you very much for giving me such a
The way I made my comments might have appeared as though it seems that political society doesn't work. That was not sort of written in this about this. And when I was thinking about welfare, I reflected upon this issue of citizenship development on the one hand and populism on the other. And I found that populism associated with caste politics and the politics of dignity on the one hand looks a lot like the political society type of arguments, because in both the cases, I mean, if I were to think conceptually, you are actually making populist demands which will only be given to sectional interests for getting voted to office. Whereas if you give an NREGS kind of thing, where it actually works, then it is a class thing. Whoever needs that kind of job will get it. If your RTI actually works, it again becomes, if not class, but on which side of the government you are, right? You want information or you. So clearly, one cannot completely dump the positive possibilities of populism when you don't have anything else. But on the other hand, I think it's important to, while conceding that, and while I think maybe Partha Chatterjee, the squatters that he was looking at and places in Chhattisgarh that you looked at probably serve, interests. But I think the attempt of the state should be to actually convert these exceptions into rights and make them more implementable. And I think in that respect, probably at least legalistically and to somewhat in places where implementation is much better, a movement is taking place. But I don't disagree with you that there are whole swathes of India where populism and the political society type of populism as well reigns, and perhaps that's the only way.
You're running out.
Question about how I felt, as it were, after writing it. I mean, it's a kind of nice question to reflect upon. And it leads me to sort of respond a little bit to Prasenjit's comment that I seem to be much more dismal in what I said, and perhaps less balanced than is the book. I think in many ways I actually felt somewhat more pessimistic after finishing writing Reinventing India than now, actually, because it did seem to me that, as I think it seemed to many people at that moment, that the Hindu nationalism was really on the rise, and the construction of a Hindu Rashtra was really on the cards, and I think that one of the changes of the last decade is that while, as we explain in the book, we think that there is a kind of banal Hindutva which is very, very widespread and which is linked to developments of relation to religious practice, perhaps particularly amongst middle classes. I think the political ascendancy of Hindu nationalism it seems to be, if you will, in check. This is now sort of linking up a response to that question with Prasenjit's very, very fair point. Perhaps in some ways, I have become not exactly more pessimistic, but more critical, even since finishing this book. And I think it's in part because I'm really struck by this total obsession with growth that marks contemporary India. There is nothing else but for so many of the political and professional classes, there's nothing else but growth, and anything to do with economic and social rights certainly has to take second place to growth. And as we say very clearly in the book, we clearly recognise the importance of economic growth for tackling problems of poverty and so on. But it's clear that from the comparative work that the impacts of growth upon the reduction of poverty in India are really very seriously constrained by the extent to which, the way in which inequality has increased. So, I mean, in a way, I think that questions about optimism or pessimism about a country is a little bit sort of kind of misplaced. I mean, you know, I suppose for all of us as citizens, there are moments where we feel kind of optimistic about our place, and times when we feel pessimistic about our place. But I don't know, I think as a scholar trying to assess change that's taking place in a society, I think it's rather difficult not to come out with a much on the one hand and on the other kind of a view. And further response. I'm sorry, I will get to other questions. I will not go on too much longer. But further response to your point, President, about the pessimism of the dismal picture that I presented. I think I might have said more in the latter part of my presentation about the significance of the recent rights legislation. The point about the lack of attention to the right to information is very well taken, because I am impressed with work that I've learnt about since writing this book, about the extent to which, through right to information, groups of people have been, village people have been able to hold the state, hold officials to account in a way which I think can be generative of mobilizations which are beyond the mobilizations around narrow identities that Professor Dial was speaking about, and that I referred to very briefly in passing. So I think I have perhaps, in some senses, in what I said, painted too dismal a picture. Post-neoliberal state. We're running out of time. I think generally I think I see this very strong tendency on the one hand towards the reliance on technocracy, the wish to, as far as possible, take key public decision making out of democratic fora, and leave it to the experts. And I think in urban governance, but particularly, there are very strong tendencies in that kind, and that I think goes with what I see as, in some senses, the reduction of citizenship to consumer citizenship. A phrase which is used by a very professional NGO that I know in Chennai quite well, and it uses the phrase consumer citizen with pride, and it emphasizes the importance of people's freedoms, but really as consumers, and that I sort of see as one part of what's going on in the post-neoliberal state. But on the other hand, there are some sorts of counter movements which may be very inchoate and limited. But and I think Nirja, your points, which I would like to take up more, but the loss of a sort of sense of public interest amongst the most sort of senior officials. That's also, I think, part of this, the tendencies in the post-neoliberal state, if we can call it that I was mentioning. But there are also some officials who have played an extremely important part in ensuring the passage of the right to information. And so, there are other things, if you will. It's not all one way. There are other tendencies on the part of senior bureaucrats and officials, and there are mobilizations which, may be very much mobilizations of intellectuals, good middle class people, but which...
As opposed to the bad ones.
Yeah, exactly. There are good ones and bad ones. Absolutely right. Put it very simply, wasn't it? Institutions of governance. I couldn't agree more that actually more analysis and more thinking about institutions of government, including Parliament itself, which Ronna Joy is working on. Very, very important. Questions about the takeoff of the Indian economy. I refer you to my colleague, Dr. Palit there. I think he's probably a better guide on the likely future trends of the Indian economy than I am. Sorry, that's a bit of a duck out, but I better stop talking.